Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this wonderful Edinburgh International Book Festival and this event with Joanne Harris, sponsored by Kobo. I'm James Runcie, I'm the chair, and I'm just going to begin with a tiny story, 30 seconds long. I want you to take your minds back to 1999. I'm a novelist. I've been trying to write a novel for 10 years. I've nearly finished it. It's called The Discovery of Chocolat. You know where this is going. My wife comes in and says, "Have you seen this?" And I say, "What? What is this? Joanne Harris's Chocolat. What am I going to do?" And she says, "Don't worry, people probably won't read it." Anyway, lots of people do read it. My novel, The Discovery of Chocolat, is published. And who should review it but Joanne Harris? Incredibly nicely and supportively and generously. And I tell you this story because, one, I'm not sure a male novelist would have done that. Controversial. But two, that generosity is typical of Joanne's ability as a storyteller. She's a very generous, humane storyteller.
I'm also easily bribed, by the way.
I thought I wouldn't be able to go longer than a minute without an interruption. Anyway, whether it's a vampire novel, a Gothic, Victorian Gothic stories, the famous food trilogy, Chocolat, Blackberry Wine, and 5/4 of the Orange, historical novels, fables, cookery book, a rune-marked fantasy series, and now their prequel, this extraordinary version of the great Norse myth, the Gospel of Loki. It's a wonderful, entertaining read that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. Joanne's hobbies are listed in Who's Who as mooching, lounging, strutting, strumming, peace-baiting, and quiet subversion of the system. Although apparently she also enjoys obfuscation, sleaze, rebellion, witchcraft, armed robbery, tea and biscuits. Please welcome Joanne Harris.
So, thank you. It's very nice to be here. It's nice to be with James again. We've got so much in common. This whole chocolate and priest thing, you know.
We have it all. We have it all to spare. I write a series called The Grantchester Mysteries, and only this morning I found out that Joanne's first novel is set in Grantchester churchyard. So it does appear that I have nicked every single thing from Joanne. So it's fairly amazing that she is still speaking to me.
I think we were separated at birth. That's
we probably were separated at birth, but I don't have any intention of writing a Norse myth.
It'll come.
It will come. So, Joanne, I think you've been interested in Norse myths from childhood. What attracted you to them?
Well, I think when I was small, I was pushed towards myths and folklore because my mother had a bit of a hoodoo about anything that she thought was trivial, anything that she thought was scary. And so I wasn't allowed to read fantasy or sci-fi or horror. But I liked those things, and so she said, well, maybe you can read this because it's got the dragons and the giant snakes and the other stuff in, but it's educational, and it will be good for you. And so I read lots of mythology, and I thought, this is how to do it. You get under the door, and you get all this cool stuff, and yet it's still educational. And I'd read the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians, but there was just something about the Norse myths. I think it was partly because, being from Yorkshire, it all felt very familiar. And the language was familiar, and you know, in Yorkshire dialect, there are Icelandic words, there are little kennings, there are references to the stories. Where I live, you can't really scratch the ground without finding Viking leavings of one sort or another. And so it seemed to me the story of my backyard. But also the characters are great and very funny and very relatable to a child.
Well, we'll come on to that. And apparently you have Viking hands.
Yes, I've got Viking hands. It's in my DNA. Apparently there is a condition called Dupuytren's contracture, which only Scandinavians and people with Scandinavian DNA get. So both my grandfathers had it. I've got it. This is one of the reasons that my signature is so messy. The ones of you who will get your books signed later will find out why.
And do you think fantasy allows you to push storytelling to greater extremes? Do you think that's partly what it's about?
It's partly about exploring things that obviously wouldn't be possible in the real world, but I've always felt that fantasy was really the secret language of the subconscious. So the fact that it has giants and trolls and elves and dragons doesn't really matter because those things are all metaphors anyway. I think you can explore reality through fantasy in quite a subversive way. because by making it look like a fairy tale, you can begin to articulate the things that are really important to people, the things that they wouldn't be able to just bring out in normal writing or normal storytelling and conversation. So you can talk about fears and demons and secret hopes, and as soon as it starts getting really close to the heart, you can just say, well, it's only a story. It's fine. You're safe.
We're living in what might be called a golden age of fantasy writing. That could be because we've got some very good fantasy writers working, but why do you think that is? What do you account for the popularity of fantasy writing?
Oh, I don't think it ever went away. I think it's always been a golden age, but I think it's been legitimized in some ways in that people are now less afraid to come out and say that they like fairy stories or that they like fantasy. I think people have begun to understand that under the surface, these things are, they're the story of humankind, and they're about where we come from and who we are. Also, they're pretty timeless, because fantasy stories not being based on issues related to the current issues of the day are very universal, and they're very inclusive. And you can use them to say all kinds of things that you wouldn't necessarily want to say in mainstream fiction. But I think that the kind of society we live in, I don't think we have ever been at a point where we needed fantasy more. I mean, originally, of course, fairy tales were supposed to be for adults and not for children. I think we went through a phase of being told that fairy tales were for children and being slightly afraid to enjoy them for that reason. But they were originally written for adults with bleak and difficult and challenging lives, and they were about making life a little more bearable. They were about answering questions that people had about all sorts of things, about death and love and just things that were difficult to deal with outside of story. And I think we live in a very difficult age. There are still lots of monsters out there. We have lots of things that need to be articulated through story. We may not believe in witches and vampires and werewolves, but we certainly have our monsters and our demons.
So in a way, it's a sort of disguised way of talking about our demons.
Absolutely.
But do you think you would have been able to move into this? I know you started writing fantasy if you hadn't written a series of novels before. Do you think that writing those great early novels gave you the confidence to branch out into this?
With me, it's not really been about confidence. I have to say, I've never really had much confidence either way. I just write the story that's there. When I was little, I wrote stories about Norse gods. I went back to writing stories about Norse gods when I had a child of the age that I had been when I discovered Norse mythology, and I realized that I hadn't written a single thing that she would enjoy. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to try and write a book that she's going to like. And so I went back to some of my early writings, and I had a long manuscript of about 3,000 pages, which I'd written when I was about 18, which was about Norse gods at the end of the world. And I read it to her, and she liked it. And she said, well, why didn't it ever get published? And I said, because it was unpublishable. And she said, well, that's no excuse. Just do it again. And so I did it again, and it became Rune Marks.
I'm interested. I was going to ask you about this a bit later, actually, but your daughter's one of your first and earliest readers, and in Muriel Sparks, A Far Cry from Kensington, she recommends writers should write as if they're writing to their closest friend. You should have that kind of intimate tone with your reader, and if you have somebody in mind or you have that intimacy, then it will have more traction. Do you often write as if you are writing to your daughter?
Only with my fantasy books, only with the Rune books and Gospel of Loki. And that was because I actually was writing for her. I wrote it chapter by chapter and read it to her before anybody else had seen them. And I was making the story as I was going along, and I adapted it according to what she liked. And it was clear that there were certain characters that she liked better than others, and she would go, I want more of him, he's funny, no, don't kill him, you have to bring him back to life, and can we have a giant snake, and can there be a werewolf, and can the werewolves be funny? And all this kind of became incorporated into the book, and eventually I cleaned it up, and somewhat to my surprise, it was published. It wasn't intended to be published, it was just supposed to be a bedtime story, but it got slightly out of hand.
Now, the thing about Norse myths are you have an existing framework, some kind of existing story. If you're writing a novel from scratch, you can do it. You can do anything. But this is quite interesting because you've got existing stories which are incomplete, they're fragments and everything. So, what's your particular take on Norse myth? What do you think you're bringing to them that is particularly Joanne Harrisy?
Well, I've kept quite reasonably true to the myths as they were written down. But of course, when they were written down, those myths were already very old. Snorri, who wrote the Eddas down, who gave them a shape, was writing from the perspective of a Christian in quite a different world, and he was writing after the Christianization of Scandinavia, and he was doing it partly to keep that oral tradition alive, although what he did transcribe was incomplete. But he also had an agenda. I think his agenda was about making a Christianized world acceptable to people who knew and enjoyed those mythologies. And so he had his own agendas in there. Nobody knows what the oral tradition really was like because it hasn't been written down. I suspect it was a lot less grand than the Eddas. I think there was a lot less self-conscious, epic verbalizing. I think it was earthier and funnier. You can tell from the myths that they were funny, that there was a kind of robust humor in there. What I wanted to do was to try and bring it back to the people and to give Loki a voice, because when I was a child, Loki was my favorite character, and he was inexplicable. You know, in the Eddas, Loki does these things that he does because he's evil. I don't think that modern audiences take that anymore. Perhaps they did in the 12th century. But nowadays, people are interested in moral ambivalence. They're interested in the trajectory that a villain passes through whilst becoming a villain. And I wanted to do that voice. I wanted to do Loki's voice and to see if I could somehow bring down the grandness of these gods in the way that I'm sure they were supposed to be brought down.
Yes, I mean, if I was answering the question that I asked you, I would say that you brought a playfulness and a sense of mischief to the character, and that mischief can either be comic or threatening, that there is that. So it is actually incredibly focused on this character of Loki, just as Milton's Lucifer is sort of possibly the central character of Paradise Lost. Mm-hmm. You've put Loki, this mischievous god, because of course then anything can happen.
Absolutely, and of course Loki lies. It's the first thing you know about Loki, that he's not going to tell you the truth. And so the concept of a gospel of Loki is already nonsense. And you know from the title that it's going to be filled with lies.
And
because
you increase that
by his nature, he's going to be a liar. But you can tell more, I think, about some people by the lies that they tell than by what they say when they're actually telling the truth. And so with this story, it's possible to kind of read between the lines and see emerging another story which isn't actually told at all, which is the story of a being who is not actually a god at all, who is brought into this citadel of gods for nefarious reasons that only Odin, the leader of the gods, knows, and who has real difficulty adjusting to being a physical creature and adjusting to all these strange moral niceties that the people around him are supposed to know about, and he doesn't.
And you tell it all from the first person, so the whole thing is from Loki's point of view.
It is, yes.
Why? Because
his point of view is not known. There's really only one poem where Loki does a lot of speaking. It's called Lokasenna, and I think it's one of my favourite poems in the Eddas. It is a brief episode just before Loki's downfall. Loki has quite a long trajectory. He starts off as a trickster, and he becomes darker and more menacing and more self-destructive. And in Lokasenna, the gods are having a party, a banquet. He hasn't been invited, even though Odin has sworn that he's never going to lift a glass of mead without Loki having a glass too. And Loki is already drunk and angry and comes into this party and ritually abuses every one of the gods. And Loki has the habit of being able to get under the skin of anybody he talks to. And so he reminds Thor of some embarrassing episodes in Thor's career. He reminds Odin that he's broken his word. He tells Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, that she farts in bed. He manages to alienate everybody, at which point his status, already difficult in Asgard, becomes less than nothing, and he runs away, and it becomes the Get Loki show.
Yes, that's roughly the plot. But I think you might like to hear a bit of the flavour of this, because it's a very particular tone. It's very authoritative and playful. So I've asked Joanne to do a little reading, if that's okay. It being a book festival, that's the kind of thing that happens.
This is from the beginning of the book, and it is when Loki has not yet been accepted into Asgard and doesn't really know anything about what it's like to be a physical being. Now, I'm not claiming Odin made the worlds. Even Odin doesn't say that. The worlds have ended and been rebuilt so many times that no one knows how they came about. But Odin certainly shaped them. To the folk of the middle worlds, that kind of power meant godhood, and with Asgard and the runes on his side, the old man was unstoppable. From the shores of the One Sea to the banks of the River Dream, everything was under his command, and his rivals, the rock folk, the unruly ice folk, were, if not entirely subdued, at least obliged to watch his triumphant ascent in sullen, angry silence. But with power comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes fear, and with fear comes violence, and with violence comes chaos. This is where yours truly comes in. Time to pay attention. Till then, I'd existed in chaos, of course, in the world of pandemonium. Chaos the pure, chaos the wild, chaos the unpolluted. Ruled by disorder in its primary aspect in the form of Lord Surt, the Destroyer, father of Glam, master of change, the original wellspring of the fire. The Vanir were only bastard fire folk, living off the scraps of Glam that fell from Lord Surt's table. But I was wildfire incarnate, a true son of chaos, happy and free. Well, maybe not entirely free, or even entirely happy. Lord Surt was a jealous master, pitiless, all-consuming. There was no reasoning with Surt. He was by nature unreasonable. You might as well try reasoning with an erupting volcano, or a thunderstorm, or the pox. And we were formless, innocent, hostile to everything that lay beyond the borders of our world, and that was how Surt meant us to stay. Perfect chaos, unfettered by form, blissfully free of all the rules of God, mankind, or physics. I, on the other hand, was perverse. It was, after all, my nature. And I was curious to know more about the other worlds that lay beyond our boundaries. Worlds in which order and chaos met and sometimes coexisted, where creatures kept to the same shape and lived and died without tasting the fire. Of course, I'd already heard of the gods. The warring parties, well, most of them, had put aside their differences, and the survivors of that war, 24 Aesir and Vanir in all, were living together in Asgard. It wasn't an easy alliance. Some of the Vanir had refused to accept Odin as their general, and had broken away to join forces with Gulveig in the Northlands. Others allied themselves with the rock folk. Some buried themselves in world below. Some fled to the forests of inland and hid away in animal form. Thus were the old runes scattered and lost, divided between our enemies, bastardized and gone to seed like grain reverting to wild stock. Of course, in time, this bastardization had its effects in chaos. Runes have their primal source in the fire, and every time Aesir or Vanir used a piece of their stolen Glam, every time they shifted aspect, or cast a rune at an enemy, every time they dipped a toe into the River Dream, or wrote down a story, or even carved their name into the trunk of a fallen tree, chaos shivered in outrage, and I grew increasingly curious. Who were these people, whose influence I could feel across the worlds? How was it that I could sense them, and did they even know I was there? Meanwhile, in Asgard, the 24 remained in a citadel blasted by war, torn by petty rivalries, arguing incessantly, easy targets for anyone who fancied trying for godhood. I saw them mostly through their dreams, which were small and unimaginative, but which nevertheless gave me food for thought. Perhaps even then a part of me knew how badly they needed a friend, and how much I could help them, if only they could put aside their puny little prejudices. In those days, the general liked to travel in journeyman aspect throughout the worlds. His blind eye, sacrificed to the runes, saw much further than his living one ever had, and he was obsessed with exploration and the pursuit of knowledge. He was a great traveller in dream, that river that skirts our borders, flowing alongside death itself, dividing this world from the next. And he would often watch our realm from the far side of the river, muttering cantrips to himself and squinting through his blind eye. He didn't look all that impressive back then. A tall man in his 50s with unruly grey hair and an eye patch. But even then I sensed that he was something out of the ordinary. For a start, he had glam, that primal fire stolen from chaos, which the folk later came to call magic and to fear with a superstitious awe. I could see it in the colours swirling all around him, and by the signature he left, as unique as a fingerprint, a broad blaze of kingfisher blue across the bleakness of rocks and snow. I'd seen that signature in dreams that were bigger and brighter than the rest, and now I could almost hear him too, his soft and coaxing voice, his words. Loki, son of Laufey, son of Farbauti, wildfire. We didn't have much need for names back in Pandemonium. Of course I had them. Everything does. But back then, they had no power over me. As for my family, such as it was, well, demons have no family. My father was a lightning strike, and my mother was a pile of dry twigs. No, that's not a metaphor, which, to be fair to yours truly, made for pretty poor parenting. In any case, wildfire is hard to control. Volatile, unpredictable. I'm not making excuses or anything, but it's in my nature to be troublesome. Surt should have known it, Odin too, both got was what coming to them. Leaving chaos was strictly forbidden, of course, but I was young and curious. I'd seen the man so many times staring into our domain, watching us from dream and beyond, working his primitive glamours. To be frank, I felt almost sorry for him, as a man sitting by a roaring fire might feel for the beggar sitting outside, trying to warm his hands with a match. But this beggar had a noble look for all his rags and shivering. It was a look that told me that sooner or later he meant to be king. I rather admired his arrogance. I wondered how he would do it. And so that day, for the first time, in defiance of Surt and of all the laws of chaos, I left my fiery aspect and ventured out into world above. For a moment, I was disoriented. Too many sensations, all of them new, enveloped my new aspect. I could see colours. I could smell sulphur. I could feel the snow in the air and see the face of the man before me cloaked in glam from head to foot. I could have chosen any form, that of an animal or a bird, or just a simple trail of fire. But as it happened, I'd assumed the form with which you may be familiar, that of a young man with red hair and a certain je ne sais quoi. The man stared at me in amazement, and, dare I say, admiration. I knew that behind my human disguise he knew me for a child of the fire, a demon if you prefer the term, although, to be honest, the difference between god and demon is really only a matter of perspective. "Are you real?" he said at last. "Well, of course, that's a relative term. Everything's real on some level, you know, even, maybe, especially dreams." But I wasn't used to speaking aloud. In chaos, such things are unnecessary. Nor had I been expecting the sheer impact of physicality, the sounds, the wind, the crunch of the snow, the thumping of a snow hare on the side of a nearby hill, the sights, the colours, the cold, the fear. Fear, yes, I suppose it was. It was my first real emotion. Chaos in its purest form is free of all emotion, working on instinct and instinct alone. Pure chaos is without thought. That's why it only ever takes shape when in the face of the enemy, taking its form from the enemy's thoughts, its substance from his deepest fears. Still, it was an intriguing experience, if somewhat claustrophobic, to keep to a single physical form, constrained by its limitations, feeling the cold, half blind with the light, assailed by all those sensations. I flexed my limbs experimentally, tried the speaking aloud thing. It worked. Still, with hindsight, I can't help thinking that if I'd really wanted to try to blend in, I should have thought myself up some clothes. I shivered. Gog and Magog, it's cold. Seriously, are you trying to tell me that you people choose to live out here? He fixed me with his one eye, blue and chilly and none too kind. Behind him his colours showed no fear, just wariness and cunning. So, you're Loki, are you? He said. I shrugged my new shoulders. What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell just as pink and virginal. And speaking of which, if you could find your way to lending me some clothes. He did. Some breeches and a shirt, taken from his backpack and smelling rather strongly of goat. I put them on, grimacing at the smell, as my new acquaintance introduced himself as Odin, one of the sons of Bor. I knew him by reputation, of course. I'd followed his career from afar. I'd watched his dreams. I wasn't what you'd call impressed, and yet his ambition and ruthlessness were not without potential. We talked. He explained his position as general in Asgard, painted a pretty picture of the Sky Citadel and its inhabitants, spoke of worlds to conquer and rich rewards to be won, then moved on to the subject of a possible alliance with my folk against the Ice People, the renegade Vianne, Gullveig Heed, and the warlords who occupied the Outlands. I had to laugh. I don't think so. Why not? I explained that Lord Surt was really not an alliance kind of guy. Xenophobic doesn't begin to cover how much he despises strangers. It's bad enough that your kind of life emerged from the ice in the first place, but you'll never get him making a deal with a race of people that ended the worlds naked and covered in cow spit. But if we could talk, said Odin. Surt doesn't talk. He's a primal force. He reduces order in all its forms into its component particles. From the mightiest warlord to the tiniest ant, he hates you all impartially. Simply by virtue of being alive and conscious, you're already an offence to him. You can't talk him around. You can't parley. All you can do if you've got any sense is simply to keep out of his way. Odin looked thoughtful. And yet, you came. Shoot me, I was curious. Of course, he didn't understand. The closest he'd ever got to chaos was through dream, its ephemeral sibling. And primitive people always imagined their gods to be something like themselves. At best, a kind of warlord, with a warlord's mentality. For all his intelligence, I could tell that Odin would never understand the scale and the grandeur of chaos. At least not until the end of the worlds, by which time it would be too late. I'm going to rule the worlds, he said. I have power, gold, runes. I have the finest warriors the worlds have ever seen. I have the sun and moon. I have the wealth of the tunnel folk. Lord Surt isn't into possessions, I said. This is chaos we're talking about. Nothing has substance or order or rules. Nothing even keeps to the same physical aspect. These things you care so much about, gold, weapons, women, battlements, I've seen them all in your dreams, and none of that means a thing to him. To Surt, it's just cosmic debris, flotsam and jetsam and the tide. Forget Lord Surt for a minute, he said. Maybe you're right. But what about you? It seems to me that someone like you could be a big hit in my camp. I bet they could. What's in it for me? Well, freedom to begin with. Freedom and opportunity. Freedom, do me a favour. Do you think I'm not free? He shook his head. You think you are? When there are worlds to discover and shape and you have to stay in one place all the time? You're no more than a prisoner of this Surt, whoever he is. I tried to explain. But chaos is like the hotbed of creation. Everything else is just overspill. Who wants to live in a septic tank? Better a king in the gutter, he said, than a slave in an emperor's palace. You see, that silver tongue of his was already making mischief. And then he started to talk to me of the worlds he'd visited, of the middle world, abode of the folk, where already the people of Asgard were beginning to be worshipped as gods, of the tunnel folk of world below, toiling to bring out gold and gems from the darkness, of the world tree, Yggdrasil, its roots in the depths of the underworld, its head in the clouds of Asgard, of ice folk, of the one sea, of the outlands far beyond, all ripe for conquest, Odin said, everything new and up for burning. All that could be mine, he said, or I could go back to chaos and spend an eternity shining Surt's shoes. What do you want from me, I said. I need your talents, said Odin. The Vanir gave me their knowledge, but even runes aren't everything. I brought this world out of blood and ice. I gave it rules and a purpose. Now I must protect what I've built, or see it slide back into anarchy. But order cannot survive alone. Its laws are too fixed, it cannot bend. Order is like ice that creeps, bringing life to a standstill. Now that we're at peace again, Aesir and Vanir, the ice will creep back. Stagnation will come. My kingdom will fall into darkness. I cannot be seen to break my own rules, but I do need someone on my side who can break them for me when necessary. And what do I get in return again? He grinned and said, I'll make you a god.
Thank you very much, Joanne. You've referred to Loki as the most modern of the Norse gods. What do you mean by that?
I think he's modern because he has a moral ambivalence that is a very modern taste. I think, if you go back 100 years or so, it was much easier to look at heroes and villains as being fundamentally distinct. But Loki is different. And I think his differences are things that modern audiences relate to much better, I think, than they might have done in the 12th century. I think he has a particular form of defiance and anger against authority and self-destructiveness that I think anybody who remembers what it's like to be a teenager will recognize. And he's very good at puncturing authority figures and questioning established thinking. And he's a true outsider. He is not a god. He never was a god. He was not made into a god. And although he was brought in to Asgard by Odin to occupy the moral low ground that Odin couldn't actually occupy himself, he was never properly accepted. His alienation, I think, is something that modern readers are more likely to understand and relate to. And he has a number of interesting aspects to him that would probably have seemed very strange in the 12th century when Snorri was writing these stories. He is gender fluid. He can become female. He even gives birth as a female horse on at least one occasion. In a society that was intensely patriarchal, where to be called womanish was probably the worst insult that you could have, this sort of blithely deciding when he wants to change gender would have been something very, very weird.
One of the things I think that is in common with a lot of, a theme that runs through some of your fiction is this disruption of order, that people come in to an ordered place and bring either change or chaos. So we see Loki, but you have this quite often in your fiction, this idea of disruption.
Yes, I think stories are all about disruption. When you look at the number of stories that begin with either a death or the arrival of somebody who is going to affect the chemistry of whatever community they arrive in. I mean, Chocolat is exactly the same. If you look at the story of Chocolat, which is the story of an outsider who arrives into a very tight patriarchal community and begins instantly to disrupt and to affect change. It's exactly the same story as Loki, who is brought into another patriarchal society, Asgard, again, who disrupts and brings change. His story doesn't end quite so well. But ultimately, I think the change is what keeps the story ball rolling.
I remember you once telling me that Chocolat was like a Western.
Very much.
That it's the same structure, it follows that same pattern of a stranger comes into town and changes it all. But obviously you have to have a very strong sense of the order of that town, the social structure. And obviously with Norse myths, you've got this amazing, amazing range of stuff. I was just wondering how you mapped it all out, how you map out. I mean, do you draw maps and do you draw routes? Do you know, because these people travel, how do you plan all this?
Well, there is already quite a well-established physical shape to the worlds as the Norse people saw them. There were 9 worlds suspended in the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree. From that, I had to extrapolate how people got from one world to another. Obviously, Asgard is separated from the world of men by the Rainbow Bridge, but it's never really explained how they get elsewhere. They just take these quantum leaps and they're suddenly in the land of the giants, or they're suddenly in the land of the fire people or the ice people. So I sort of played around with the geography of it a bit, but it is a world picture which has very little to do with geography or physics or what's possible. It is all psychic travel.
But you still have to have a strong sense of this, hundreds of characters. I mean, it's quite complicated to keep it all in your head, I imagine.
Well, I've been familiar with these characters for some time, so it wasn't too tricky. But I did select the ones that I wanted to talk about, and some of them, of course, are just names. In the Eddas, some of them are just named maybe once. And you can tell that there are a whole raft of stories about that one named character that just haven't made it. And so some of those characters I expanded because I thought they were interesting, and made up stories about them to fit in with the myths, but I tried to keep as true to the myths as possible.
And can you tell us a little bit about runes and rune stones? Because I gather you have your own runes as well. Tell us about how you use runes in your fiction.
Well, it's a difficult topic because it's very clear to anybody who learns Old Norse and Icelandic that runes were very important. Runes are on everything, and there are lots of references in the language to different kinds of runes. There are runes of victory, there are runes of power, there are runes of love, there are runes of binding. So it's not just an alphabet, it is a system of magic. We don't know how quite they were used. They came back into fashion in the 70s, and it was decided that you could use them to tell the future. There's no proof that the Vikings used them to tell the future at all. And so I kind of invented a runic system that I thought fit in with the culture and what I know from the language. But, it's as good a system as any. And so my runes work as symbols of focusing power. It was clear that when you read the Eddas and when you study the languages, it was possible to cast runes, to throw them like missiles. It was also possible to work them into sigils. And it was also clear that sometimes they were just used as symbols of certain things, a rune for love, a rune for wealth, a rune for power. And so I kind of built a system that worked around there, which seemed to me plausible.
And you've made your own, I think, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah, and you throw them and...
I started making runes when I was very little. I realised that if you got a magic marker and some pebbles, you could make runes. And so I was always making little bags of runes and giving them to people. It's when I was touring schools for rune marks, it was one of the things I used to teach little kids to do, because I think sometimes my publishers didn't quite realise that it was a book more for adults than for children. So I went to some very, very small children, and I didn't really want to talk about the story, and so I just taught them how to make the runes. And even 5- and 6-year-olds understand how runes work, because they're very graphic, they're very simple.
It's interesting, I think, though, that you start with something quite childlike, and it becomes increasingly and terrifyingly adult. So you actually mirror the development of human beings through this fantasy. And it's the same with your humour, that starts kind of quite fun, and then it obviously gets fantastically dark, particularly when I think we all know Loki sort of slightly, is guilty of creating mischief and...
Spoilers here.
Yeah, murder. Okay, murder. Killing
sort
people.
of murder.
Sort of murder.
Not tangential murder.
Yes, well, framing people for murder.
Yeah.
I mean, quite bad.
He's quite a problematic character in a number of ways.
Yes. But do you the projection you do on that, is it helpful to start? I mean, you give him an arc to travel, don't you?
Yes, because he does have one. Obviously, he's brought into Asgard, and the first myths. Obviously, there's no real order in these myths. Snorri has written them down in one order, but I've tried to give them a proper shape. But yes, Loki starts off doing things which are annoying, but not really downright evil. Like cutting off Sif's hair, and basically just rather stupid, childish, rude tricks, rather than things that later he does, which are destructive and self-destructive. And you realise that he is on a kind of downward spiral, and that he almost seems to want to bring it on himself. For instance, this Lokazena, this poem where he goes to this party and insults the gods one by one, it's almost as if he's making sure that nobody is going to be his friend for the next bit. And then there is the death of Balder, and everything goes terribly pear-shaped, and Loki is left going, oh, what did I do? But he knows that he's set himself up somehow. And it's an interesting psychological progression from just being this very immature being, and I took that as simply him not knowing what it was like to be a human, because he is a physical form, but he hasn't really quite learnt what it's like, and he hasn't really come to terms with human feelings and morality. But after that, he becomes more and more demonic in his nature, and seems to have reached a point where he would like very much to belong to the gods in Asgard. He would like to be wanted and liked by them, but the other half of him is constantly defying and upsetting them, and knows that eventually he's going to get kicked out.
Well, he now belongs to you, the readers, so if you'd like to ask some questions, please do, and put it behind, and a microphone will come to you, and I will organise it. There's a gentleman here, if we could have him first. Anybody over? And then, I don't know how many people we've got, but anyway, the gentleman in the stripes.
You mentioned that as a child you read Egyptian and Greek mythology as well as Norse mythology, as opposed to Norse mythology. Did you draw on other mythologies in your writing? Because it sounds as if the kind of moral ambiguity that you talk about could be found as well in Greek and also in Indian mythology. And the way you describe the runes also sounds a bit like the astras or divine weapons that you find in Hindu mythology. So I was wondering if you drew on other mythologies at all.
I do, yes. Although I think that, there are many things that mythologies and belief systems have in common. There are so many things that they have in common that, it's tempting to think that there is a sort of algorithm, because of course mythology wasn't always mythology. It was at one point religion, and given your perspective and your historical standpoint, a religion can then become a myth as another religion takes over. And I think there are kind of all sorts of overlapping themes and archetypal characters who pop up in world religions all over the place. So I think inevitably I've drawn on that, but I think it's partly because the pool of belief systems is so close to what's important to human beings that they all have these things in common. They all have these ambivalent characters, and very often the moral ambivalence of the gods is one of the main themes that build a belief system. And Christianity is a bit of an odd one out that way.
Anybody over here? Anybody over here? Yes, two here, the lady and then the man.
I think my mother may have known your mother because I was force-fed the Norse myths as well. This is maybe a bit of a trivial question. Have you aware of the recent Marvel films, and in which case, what do you think of Tom Hiddleston as Loki?
I would have had to have been on another planet not to be aware of the recent Marvel films. I think they're lots of fun. I think Tom Hiddleston knows his myths and has brought something quite special to that role. I find myself saying, with increasing defensiveness when people bring up this topic, that I wrote Rune Marks 4 years before the first Thor movie came out. Therefore, I am lucky in that I wasn't influenced by Tom Hiddleston, or maybe unlucky. Perhaps he was influenced by me. But no, I think the thing is, one of the nice things about these myths is that they have been used and reused by so many different people in so many different ways. And that doesn't happen to all mythological systems. Obviously, there is something more relatable about the Norse myths because they have been used more. They are still loved. They're still alive. People are still reinterpreting them. This is a good thing. And it's a big sandbox. And lots of people have played in it. And this is why the myths are still active, as opposed to some others that have kind of sunk into obscurity. So yes, I think they're lots of fun, but they're not really... they're not really my bit at the sandbox.
Subtext there. Just, yeah.
Cheeky question for you.
Yeah, if you just hold it like an ice cream.
A cheeky question for you. Do you have a religious faith?
I don't subscribe to a religious belief, no. That doesn't quite answer your question. It's not supposed to. I'm very interested in religions. I'm very interested in what people believe, have believed, and why. But no, I am not a subscriber. I don't go to a church. I wouldn't describe myself as a somethingist or something like that, which doesn't mean to say that I don't have my own sense of the divine. But I don't think it really fits into anybody else's church.
Anybody? Surely there must be somebody from over here. Yes, the lady here. Of course, one doesn't need to believe to write about belief. That's one of the great paradoxes of our times, which is a weird thing, but not for this session, perhaps.
But we all believe in something. We don't necessarily call it the divine. We don't necessarily have a name for it, but, we all believe in something. My father believes in the healing power of Bran, for instance.
Yes.
We have a great number of scientific, dietary, and vaguely philosophical beliefs that have kind of overlapped with religious faith. Anyway, I'm cutting into your question.
Yes.
It's okay. I just wondered when you had Chocolat made into a film, do you have any input as to choice of actors or such like for the film?
I had a certain amount of input. I had more input than most authors have, which is still very little. They were very nice to me. They listened to my opinion, and then they duly mostly ignored it. But that was okay, because, that's what happens when you give the rights to a book. You don't have any anymore. And so they were very nice to me, and I was consulted, and when I said something that they wanted to hear, they listened. The rest of the time, I just had a good time, because actually that's probably the way you stay sane, really, if your book makes it to the screen. The best thing to do is just to enjoy the show, which I did enormously.
Have you got anything else? Is there anything? Have you sold the rights to other stuff?
I'm always selling the rights to things, but it hardly ever makes it to screen, But I didn't realise when Chocolat was optioned how unusual it was that something was optioned and then made into a movie almost straight away. I was so inexperienced in the whole world of publishing and films that I just kind of took that as the norm. It really isn't. So I've sold the rights to the others many times over, and they've never quite made it, and one day maybe they will, and yeah, that would be nice too, but it's I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, well, working in film and television is a good introduction to lying, I can tell you. We've maybe given you the basis. And so anybody over here? Or anybody? Questions? Yes? A lady there?
Hi. Lots of your books are sort of centred around food, obviously, as a sort of central part. Did you miss food when you were writing Gospel of Loki? I know there were jam tarts, but there wasn't a great deal else.
There's a fair bit of food in Gospel of Loki, actually. But the thing is, I never set out to write about food. I happened to find food was a useful metaphor for certain things. And so I've always written about it because it's one of many things that I write about. And I found that when I wrote Chocolat particularly and Blackberry Wine, people noticed the food a lot more than I thought they would. I didn't realise how hungry a lot of my readers were. And it was quite nice sort of putting little passages of food voodoo in there, thinking, right, this will get them, and imagining people rushing for the fridge. But it's to me, that was just one of the ways to the heart of a story. It wasn't the only way. But there is a surprising amount of feasting in Norse myth, and in fact in all myth, because the mythic feast is one of the central things that nearly all mythologies seem to share. This ritual of eating and sometimes also fasting. And that to me is a very kind of mythic thing.
Yeah. One more? Anybody over that? I'm sorry. Or I'll just... Well, let me just ask, are you going to... This is the prequel to and so what are you doing? What on earth are you doing next?
I'm constructing a very elaborate Rubik's Cube here, and I'm also making it up as I go along, so I don't know what's going to happen. I wrote Gospel of Loki as a sort of prequel to my rune books, but it also stands alone. I will at some point continue writing at least one of my rune books, but I also want to write a sequel to the Gospel of Loki. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated and where the timelines start to diverge. I am hoping that I will find some wonderful inspiration that will make all of these books, and I think there might be 5 or maybe 6 of them, converge and fit into the same universe. This is tricky because rune marks and rune light are in a sort of alternative version of the world, set in an alternative England where the Romans never made it, and therefore Scandinavian culture is still dominant. The Gospel of Loki is set really between the beginning of the world, its creation, which, as we all know, was licked out of the ice by a giant cow, to Ragnarok, which is the end of the world, where everything stops. Now, my theory always was that Ragnarok isn't the end of the world, it's simply the end of the world for a culture and its belief system. The world continues, but with other gods, other belief systems taking over. Now, my sequel to the Gospel of Loki, if you like, is going to jump to the present day.
Oh.
And I'm going to have, if I can manage, Norse gods in the present day.
What, going shopping?
Not so much.
Norse gods in the present day?
Yes.
That's a very exciting challenge to set yourself.
It is a bit. I don't know why I set myself these challenges, really. I could have just written another book about chocolate, couldn't I? But to me, it's interesting because there are so many strands of this story that could be explored, and one of the themes of all these books is the relationship between reality and dream. And it's something I've been writing about in a lot of my books, not just the mythological-based ones, for a long time. And I wanted to do something that brought the myth into the present day. And I thought perhaps the fun way to do that would be to investigate the roots out of dream that we haven't thought of in connection with myths at all. One of them is the internet, which I've written about before in a book called Blue-Eyed Boy, which was a nasty, disgusting book, which some of you may or may not have read. But no, the idea that these are all kind of paths leading to different areas of story.
Yes.
So I thought that might be quite fun to explore.
Everything is story.
Indeed.
We have to stop there. Joanne is going to sign copies of Loki next door. We'd like to thank you all for coming and thank Kobo for sponsoring this event. Thank you so much. This is reality. You've been a dream.